time for a ghost story. Glenrothes and the legend of, I'm going to say Byway, because it's my YouTube channel. So the story is in Speyside, you've got Glenrothes Distillery. And actually the story of Byway, and his actual name, I'm not going to pronounce correctly, but he was from Zimbabwe. And it actually starts at the Glenrothes Distillery. Remember in Speyside, that little region like of Scotland had the little edge hand right here. It's right up here before you get up into the Northern Highlands. And in that area is just densely packed distillery after distillery after distillery. I mean, Macallan's not far from these guys. Glen Grant, Glenrothes, so many more. Anyway, so Major James Grant is kind of entrepreneur, businessman, landowner, and he's on the front edge of things. He's the first to do electric lighting in the Glen Grant distillery. He got specialized stills that resulted in the Glen Grant flavor profile. Anyway, he's traveling with his wife and some friends, and they're on a hunting expedition in Zimbabwe. And they come across these two orphan boys who were being taken care of by an elderly farming couple. And they don't seem to be doing well, and Zimbabwe wasn't doing well at the time. And so they decide they're going to adopt these boys, and his partner and his wife, and then he and his wife both took these boys back to Scotland and gave them a home and employed them, gave them jobs in the household. And at first, he came to be known as Byway. He got fully connected into the community. He ended up playing on the soccer team, football team, totally football team. And he becomes a footman. When World War I starts, he joins the army. He ends up stationed in multiple places, wins multiple medals, comes back from the war, and he moves back into the Glen Grant house. And then things start changing. But he became so much a part of the football league locally that he was in the box seat, and he was very well known. In 1931, Major Grant dies, and then things start changing, and eventually the place where Byway lives is turned into an inn and house, and it's just the sort of the end of his life, which I think he died in the 70s, like 1972, I think. The last part of his life, the last like 40 years, is sort of things changing a lot for him. And he ends up passing away. He deeds all of his money to the local Rothes football club. And the Glenrothes distillery turns out to be next door to the gravesite where Byway's grave is. And there start being all these stories about sightings of Byway, ghost sightings in the Glenrothes distillery and around the Glenrothes distillery. So let's talk about Glenrothes. Glenrothes is a pretty renowned Speyside, Speyside, Scotch, and 1879, and they worked with Berry Brothers and Rudd. They've got a really long history, and they've really done a great job of holding to certain age statements, but they were also one of the distilleries that recently has switched to no age statement, kind of like bourbon cask reserve, sherry cask reserve, and things like this. But this is the Glenrothes 18. Now, they specifically seek out sherry casks, and they oversee how those sherry casks are used before they get to them. And so this one I always find to be a really massive explosion of deep sherry. And it is. It's right up there with Glendronach and Aberlour and the nose of a Macallan. It's plum and fruit and pastry and sugar, caramel candy like Werther's Original. It really is just fruit pastry. In Texas, this would be a kolache. Like a grape or a apricot kolache. Now, There it is. Okay. The thing that I always find with Glenrothes is that it starts, and the nose is this just massively sweet, beautiful candy and earth. And then the palate, you get all of the funky, earthy malt notes that are specific to Glenrothes. And that divide of beautiful, elegant, candied nose and deep, earthy malt floor on the palate, that to me is Glenrothes. The bourbon cask does the same thing. The bourbon cask smells like Werther's Originals, pure and simple. And then you taste it and it's malty and funky and I like that. At first I didn't like that. But I drank this was a part, not this one, but the Bourbon Reserve Glenrothes has been a part of my tour of Scotland for, 10 years that I've been at Wizard Academy. And so I'm very familiar with Glenrothes. The 18 is the one I pour to show what Glenrothes does with a really dominated sherry. The finish is surprisingly short, and I think that comes down to the 43%, but it's still nice, and the lingering taste is candied pastry, sweet pastry. Anyway, so in 1980 or the 80s, they did, or before 80, they did construction. In 1980, they opened up a new still house at Glenrothes, and they were having all these problems with the stills, and they weren't performing the way that they should based on everything that they had done. And there were all these sightings of Byway, the ghost, around the distillery. And so they were convinced that for some reason, Byway was pissed and screwing with the stills, basically. So this dude, and this is real, this feels like some sort of episode of like Fringe or something, but this is totally real. It actually happened. Professor Cedric Wilson comes from a local, he hears about it, and he is he studies paranormal activity and spiritualism, and he goes, oh, I can come figure this out. So they let him in, and he shows up like the Ghostbusters, and he walks around, and he looks at some things, and he decides that there's these key lines, ley lines, that are like, and the new production had crossed a important ley line. I use quotes because, what do you do with that, really? Ley lines across, that they had violated the ley lines that were between Byway and his grave and Glen Grant and the Glenrothes distillery, and they needed to make it right. So the story is that he goes, two stories. One, and his formal story, I think, was that he went in, they hammered iron rods into specific spaces, sort of like, I guess, feng shui, and that solved the ley lines. But there's also a version of the story where they will go as a group, and he proceeds to go into the cemetery by himself and stand in front of Byway's grave and hold an entire conversation with gesticulation. And no one knows what he's saying, but he's evidently having a discussion. And when he comes back, he says, "It'll be fine now." And it was fine. And that's what's absurd, is that, guys, it was fine. The still started working. The sightings of Byway stopped. And I just don't know what to do with that. And so instead, I drink Glenrothes 18. Cheers to you. Thanks for spending time with me. I'm really glad you're here.